Hello learners, I hope you're all doing well. So today we are going to be covering the 15th module of our course, which is Ecology, or the relationships of organisms with one another and the environment. Now in this video we will be covering section 1, in which we will be talking about exactly what ecology is. So you guys must have noticed that up till now, all of the modules we've covered, in those modules we've tried to understand what makes up a living organism and how it functions. And needless to say, it takes a lot to ensure that a living organism functions efficiently and continues to survive and reproduce. But actually, there's more to biology than that. So we also need to understand how different living organisms exist in the same place with one another, that is called their habitat, and how they interact with each other as well as the environment that surrounds them. Now, if you might recall from the first module of cells, we discussed organization at the cellular level. So we discussed how different cells, they make up tissues, then different tissues come together to form organs, and then different organs, they make up organ systems, and then all the organ systems, they make up an entire living organism. So actually in the environment, there exist certain similar levels of organization, and all the living organisms within that environment are a major part of these levels. So the first level is when living organisms belonging to the same species, they are existing within the same habitat and they're interacting with each other, and this is called a population. So for example, wherever you're living, that is your habitat, and you are part of the human population living in that habitat. Now, the next level is when different living organisms belonging to different species are existing within that same habitat, and they're also interacting with each other as well as the environment, and that is called a community. So for example, let's consider that you are living in a certain part of Lahore, that is, for example, defense, right? So the defense is actually the community in which different populations of different species of living organisms are existing. So for example, you are the human population, then there is maybe a cat population or a dog population, and then of course different species of trees and plants are existing as well. So this everything makes up a community. Now, when different communities, they exist and they interact with one another and as well as the environment, that is what we call an entire ecosystem. And all the ecosystems that are present within this world make up the biosphere. Now, actually, when I talk about the environment, I mean two things. So there is the biotic environment and the abiotic environment. The biotic environment is basically that environment which comprises of all the living things. So we can actually take the meaning from the word biotic, because biotic means living. Now the abiotic environment, on the other hand, of course, abiotic means non-living. So this environment comprises of all the non-living things that are existing in the environment. For example, number 1, the sunlight. So sunlight is basically the main principal source of energy, and sunlight is obviously very important for all the living organisms existing within an environment, because it affects the rate of photosynthesis of the plants, and of course because we all living organisms actually depend on plants for their food, so it also affects like animals, humans, and basically every living organism that is existing within the environment. Number 2, the oxygen content. So obviously oxygen is extremely important for all living organisms. So let me give you an example. So the mangrove forest or the mangrove trees have these roots which are embedded inside oxygen poor soil. So obviously, how do they get the oxygen that they need to carry out all their cellular activities? Well, basically they are adapted in a way that their roots have these certain extensions which are actually jutting out of the soil. So those parts of the roots absorb the oxygen from the atmosphere, and then that is how they get the oxygen that they need. Now, number 3, the water content. Of course, water is an essential nutrient that is required by so many, like every living organism really. And yes, there are certain environments in which water is scarce. There's like less water available for all the living organisms to use. So for example, let's take the desert. So obviously there exists living organisms within the desert, like for example camels and certain plants that exist within this environment. Now these animals and these plants are actually adapted to store water within them. So for example, camels are able to store excess water, and then they can go on for long periods of time without drinking fresh water. So that is how they've adapted themselves to their environment. Number 4, temperature of the environment. So we know that the temperature affects the rate of enzyme reactions within a living organism. So of course, all these chemical reactions are going to be affected by the temperature of the environment. Number 5, the pH of the soil and the water that is existing in the environment. So of course, pH again affects the different rates of enzyme reactions, and then in this way as well, the chemical reactions that are occurring in a living organism are going to be affected by the pH of the environment as well. Number 6, the salinity of the soil and the water, that is the salt concentration of the soil and water that is present within an environment. Now this actually affects the water potential of different solutions, right? So as we've discussed in the module of diffusion, osmosis and active transport. So of course, if the water potential is going to be different, then the entry of water inside the cells or outside the cells is going to be affected. So this is how all of these factors which exist in the abiotic environment are affecting the different living organisms that are existing within that same environment.